Welcome to Module 4, Governance Models in Systems Planning, brought to you by the Systems Planning Collective. This module is part of the Systems Planning Collective's curriculum. The full curriculum will be hosted on the Homelessness Learning Hub. Throughout this module, we encourage you to write down any questions you may have and then head over to the discussion forum on the Homelessness Learning Hub to start a conversation. Systems Planning Collective members will review these questions and get back to you. I'm your host, Lindsay McRae, and I'm a Communications Officer at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Now, I'll introduce you to your instructor, Alina Turner, Principal of Turner Strategies, co-founder and CEO of helpseeker.org, and fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on Module 4, Governance Models in Systems Planning, and what we think is a foundational piece of our systems planning curriculum, and that's primarily because how we choose or not choose to govern our community-based work is going to obviously influence the kinds of outcomes that we have and the ways we go about getting them. So really important for us to have clarity around governance as we engage in this important work. So why do we care about governance in homeless serving system? And that's of course the major question when we think about our reaching home work. And reaching home, for those of you that are not familiar, is the funding stream out of the Government of Canada, also known as the Homelessness Partnering Strategy in previous iterations, or HPS. And under Reaching Home, communities that are given access to federal funding to do homelessness work have to obviously achieve 4 major community level outcomes. And so that includes things like reducing homelessness overall, especially in key populations such as Indigenous peoples or youth. There's also the focus on chronic homelessness and reducing that number of people experiencing long-term homelessness, reducing new inflows into homelessness through, especially around prevention work, and then reducing returns to homelessness so that people are not constantly churning in and out of the homeless serving system. And so with those big picture system goals in mind, we want to think about how our governance model is supporting the community to achieve these outcomes. And of course, how your community entity and community advisory boards are structured and how they relate to each other and other parts of the ecosystem and your social safety net are also pieces that you want to be intentional about. And so that's really what we want to get into in this module, to help you think through the governance models, the pros and cons of various approaches, and just give you some guidance and big picture tips and tricks that can help you shape your homeless serving systems work in relation to that bigger social safety net. And so let's look at the evolution of system planner organizations in this context. And I mentioned that under Reaching Home, we have the community entity that has that responsibility to manage the funding stream, and then they work in tandem with the community advisory board to that effect. And so those key components are likely present in your community, but that doesn't necessarily mean the CAB or the CE are actually your system planner organization, or maybe there is no system planner organization in your community that's leading systems planning work. And so let's drill into this evolution of what a systems planning organization does and doesn't do in the context of homelessness. And then you can think through, do I have this in my community? Is this being done by a number of organizations so that together we deliver this function, or is it somebody that we haven't even brought into the conversation yet that we might need to? So the big thing is, of course, that work, that strategic systems planning work. So there's somebody likely that's leading the development and implementation of your strategy or your plan around homelessness. Now, I say that, but sometimes we have multiple organizations doing multiple plans. So it's not as obvious as it might seem. However, that is a critical role of this lead organization for sure. And so they might design and develop, implement the homeless serving system structures, the various program types at play, and they might also be in charge of at least conceptualizing the homelessness management information system, and they might implement it to a certain extent. They definitely have a key role in engaging stakeholders, including people with lived experience in their plan implementation work. They champion homelessness at various levels as well, of course, in tandem with other stakeholder groups. And they do quite a lot of relationship and trust building among stakeholder groups to ensure that we have clear and transparent processes as we move through this work. They, as I mentioned before, have some relationship with diverse funding streams. In some cases, they might directly fund programs, and so they have direct accountability. If in the case of a community entity, they certainly do. In other cases, they might have indirect control of funding, or they might provide government with recommendations around what they should and shouldn't fund from that bigger community perspective lens. And so they do have some level of influence around funding, direct or indirect. And the purpose of that, of course, is that they are looking to streamline the impact of and maximize the impact of said funding around common homelessness prevention and ending goals. And so to obviously achieve that, they do performance management work. They might develop key performance indicators for the community. They might develop service standards and influence service standards across funding bodies, quality assurance and investment monitoring. They have key roles to play in these arenas. And of course, they have a critical role to play in innovation and continuous improvement because they're constantly developing new ideas and testing and prototyping things like housing first programming or prevention programming to align them to best practices, but also to learn what's happening at the community level and provide that technical assistance and training locally and contribute to the body of knowledge at the national or provincial / territorial levels. So this in sum is this role of the system planner organization. And as I mentioned before, it might be your community entity. It might be a combination of organizations that together seem to fulfill this function. And it's important to understand that because when we talk about governance, if this function is decentralized or is happening across different departments or is happening across organizations within government, within different nonprofits, it all matters, of course. And so have a think about where this function is currently happening in your community and how that's working. But either way, this is a really critical part to think through as we move into the system planner organization and how it manifests in terms of governance models. And here are just some examples how this function plays out. And as I mentioned before, there's no right way or wrong way in delivering this in communities. It's just something that you want to be mindful of and intentional about. And so, for instance, in Medicine Hat, you have a board of directors that provides governance to a nonprofit that acts as the system planner organization around homelessness. And that organization might have different advisory committees that come together for, let's say, a call for proposals, and they might have a lived experience council and some other advisory bodies on key projects as well. In other communities, such as Lethbridge or Ottawa and Red Deer, and those are just some examples, and this is a very, very common model where you have an advisory committee that acts as a means of providing guidance to a municipal department that is fulfilling that system planner role and manages the funding stream for the federal government and in some cases provincial governments as well. And so together the committee and the municipal department have that system planner organization role to different extents in these contexts. And then of course we have some interesting variations in Victoria where we have a nonprofit coalition model, so that collective impact, if you're familiar with collective impact, and if you're not, I would point you to our module number 1 where we go into further depth around these concepts. But in Victoria, the coalition works with a board of directors who represents the mayors of, or is made up of mayors across the regional district. And then Yellowknife, where it's a committee of council that is now morphing into a higher level commission made up of various decision makers from government and industry, as well as nonprofits. And so again, no right way or wrong way. It's to give you some sense of the variations across the country that you might identify with. So wanted to get in depth a little bit because the board of director model is so common in this conversation, and it's something that I often see as sometimes confusing organizations and coalitions that are trying to engage in this work. And I wanted to clarify this because, again, because of the Reaching Home funding stream and this emphasis on community advisory boards, we often confuse a nonprofit board to be a community advisory board, and that's obviously not the same thing. However, you can understand, given the word board in both of those terms, why that may be causing some confusion. So an important piece of clarification is around this idea of a nonprofit board and what it is and what it isn't. And obviously it becomes quite relevant if the community entity is housed within a nonprofit or a charity, so not within municipal government, of course. And so in that context, the fiscal accountability ends with the board at the board level. And so the model that the board chooses to govern through is obviously at their discretion, but it might take various forms. So here we have three examples that we see quite commonly: the results-based model, an advisory board model, or the policy or carver model. And so these are three, but there's a whole range of options that a board of directors would be familiar with and would need to consider in developing their processes and procedures moving forward. But the big thing to emphasize here is that the nonprofit board is not the same thing as a community advisory board. And so sometimes we see instances where the community advisory board that's really a committee that provides this advice to the community entity around funding, starts acting like a nonprofit board. And you can see the confusion in that, because if you have a nonprofit that has a board of directors and then there's a community advisory board at the same time, sometimes they're actually jostling for power and there's confusion around roles. But ultimately, from a legality perspective, and again, we're not lawyers and we're not giving legal advice, but from a fiduciary accountability perspective, the board of directors of the nonprofit to whom the executive director reports is ultimately the decision maker in that situation, rather than the community advisory board that happens to provide advice on the Reaching Home funding stream. So just a really important emphasis here that those are actually very, very different purposes and accountabilities as well. And how your nonprofit board chooses to, like I said, govern, that will vary, obviously, and it might try to be a policy governance model and get into operations, and we can get into, the pros and cons of each of these models. But suffice it to say, we wanted to emphasize these as being intentional and sometimes shifting over time as well as the organization grows and changes how they do their work. So what are community advisory boards then, if the board of director has that accountability around a nonprofit or charity's governance model and relationship to management? So the community advisory advises the community entity on funding decisions and aligns these to community-wide goals around homelessness, and is ultimately not financially responsible to the funder. The C will have a board of directors in the case of a nonprofit or charity model, and in that case, that board of directors is who is responsible to the funder. So just a point of clarification. Around Reaching Home directions, and here's what guidance we have from Reaching Home around CABs and CEs. They're the organizations that together lead this direction in the homeless serving system. And this governance is carried out through the CAB and C as distinct entities or collectively. And so here we have an example from End Homelessness St. John's, where there's an instance of collective governance shared between the CE and the CAB. Regardless of which model you take, if you are under Reaching Home, this requires local system planning moving forward, enhancing this role of the community entity as a system plan organization lead. And so thinking through that and your relationships as CE and CAB moving forward might shift depending on your current approach. A little bit more detail on a CAB versus a community entity, and this again is a guidance from the Government of Canada's work on CABs and CEs, but essentially the CAB is representative of the community, completes that community plan in conjunction with the community entity, and recommends projects for funding. So the note there is recommend, doesn't make the decision, it recommends or puts forward recommendations for the CE's consideration. In the case of the community entity, they consider those projects recommended by the CAB, they manage all the contracts and the sub-project funding recipients, and so they have that key role in relation to the monitoring and reporting of sub-project results. They do that investment planning on a portfolio basis, and they do the reporting back to the community entity and to the public or their own boards of directors or municipal reporting mechanisms in the case of a city department leading this work. And then of course, anything around performance and financial and risk management, they would be responsible for, because they're the ones that have that agreement with the Government of Canada in this context. And then there's of course this stuff in the middle, the fuzzy gray, where there is work that's done between or together with the CAB. So things like leadership and partnerships, obviously that's better done in a collective community-based approach. The solicitation of proposals and managing that process together, getting the word out about funding opportunities, doing those partnership development pieces of work that are so essential. And then the completion of the community plan updates and reporting on, here we talk about shelter data, but there could be other point in time count data or other research that might be happening in the community. So lots of overlap between these, but together they certainly make up a key component of your governance approach to systems planning around homelessness. So local evolutions, the community advisory board, the community entity, and the board of directors. And another emphasis here that, those are three distinct functions, and so might or might not exist in your community within the same organization or collective of organizations. But to emphasize again that in some communities we have the community entity that is in a nonprofit or charity that reports to the board of directors, and then they have an advisory board that works with the CE staff to make recommendations. But ultimately, again, the buck stops with the board of directors in this context. If you flip and think through how this might manifest in a municipal government context, obviously the city council is the ultimate sayer. The community entity would be the department within the municipality responsible for the funding stream management and all of that work on the ground in operations. And they would have a community advisory board that would work with said department to fulfill those CAB functions. But again, in this context, and those of you working in municipal government will very well know that the board of directors being city council means that the decision making ultimately stops with city council, and so has to work through the committee structure and senior management within the municipal government mechanism. On CAB membership, I wanted to give some emphasis here on perhaps best practices, or at least recommended practices, on the types of stakeholders you would consider having in your CAB. So those of you who might be new to CAB work or who might be looking at revising your CAB membership, this might be some useful guidance to think through. First and foremost, people with lived experience, and here we would put an asterisk and say lived/living experience if possible. So thinking through that piece is going to be important, and having representation on your CAB or through a committee of the CAB would be something to consider. The homeless serving system representatives as well would be very, very common already in your structure. And so the only caution here is to ensure the conflict of interest isn't at play in cases when you are soliciting proposals, of course. So you don't want to have the same organizations making decisions about funding that's being allocated in a competitive process. And again, I don't want to say easier said than done, but we certainly see conflict of interest as being a very common challenge, unfortunately, and one that should be easy to avoid with strong governance policies and clarity around that funding allocation process. Public and private funders are commonly represented on CABs as well, and that again helps you at the community entity level have engagement with other funders and coordination of funding streams directly or indirectly. The homeless serving system lead agency, so the community entity, obviously would be part of this and would likely have some role in facilitating or co-facilitating with the chair of the CAB. Business sector representatives are common, as well as government staff. And here we highlight housing, health, and justice, but there's certainly children's services, education that could be brought into this as well. The participating agency staff that may or may not be funded as well are commonly found here too. And not thinking just about the homeless serving agencies, but also those in your poverty reduction or prevention ecosystem would be important to have perspectives represented from. Okay, so looking at this further, let's think through the different governance models that we commonly see and the pros and cons of each of them. And I mentioned before this idea of a department within an existing organization. And so you might have a nonprofit or a charity that may be a service-focused organization providing support to clients directly, or perhaps a funding organization that takes on the homelessness portfolio as part of its work. And so you might have a department or a person that's in charge of the Reaching Home stream or the homelessness system planning stream within that existing organization. Another option is to develop, or some of you might already exist in a standalone organization solely focused on homelessness systems planning. And examples of that would be the Calgary Homeless Foundation, where their entire mandate is around this work. So it's not a department within an existing nonprofit or charity, it's solely the purpose of that entity to do this work. And then option 3, again, very common across the country, where the municipality is the community entity. And so a department within the municipality might be charged with this work. And of course, that, as I mentioned before, this will have different ramifications from a governance strength and risks perspective. And so some of the option 1 hosted department strengths and risks, and you might see overlap between all of these, and there might be things that we missed as well that come to mind, but just some framework for you to consider as you either develop your own or think through whether it's time to evolve your current model moving forward. So the strength of the hosted department is obviously having dedicated positions, and then the built-in infrastructure you get from an organization that already exists. So you don't have to get your own HR, your legal, your office space and admin. You can kind of borrow from that central admin, and it's already built in. You don't have to spend the time to develop it yourself. You already have legitimacy with a broader community because the said organization already has a history of operating locally, and so you're not starting something brand new. An existing department can leverage the mothership, so to speak, to do its work. Now, the risks, of course, especially in organizations that might have different funding priorities or might do service provision and systems planning at the same time, is that it can of course go into some role confusion. So what's the role of the CAB in governance if it's an organization that has a separate board of directors? And I mentioned how weirdly common this is, where the CAB and the board of directors of that organization have some conflict because there is lack of clarity around who is the ultimate decision maker. And believe it or not, the board of directors has to be, they legally are the decision maker. There's no choice in the matter. So that clarity is easier said than done because there's that role confusion in these models, unfortunately. The context around Indigenous support for non-Indigenous organizations. So if this hosted department is in a non-Indigenous organization, and that can happen with any of the other models as well, you might not have that Indigenous support or legitimacy as well. That's something to think about and certainly a risk. The limits on fundraising activities as well, depending on whether the nonprofit or charity engages in fundraising activities, is obviously something to consider as well. And fundraising has a cost and it might not be a priority in relation to other organizational objectives. And it may also look as something that's not really new and nothing new is really happening because it's just another department. It's a tack on priority. And so it might not give the issue the profile people feel it might need in this context. So some of those are the common risks. In a standalone organization, obviously the benefit would be this renewal that it might spur around commitment and a fresh start in a community, especially if you're looking like St. John's to one day have a standalone organization that's a nonprofit committed to the plan, strategy development and implementation. So there's this renewal and fresh approach, and that can sometimes be really powerful in bringing new players to the board and re-energizing the community. The clear role for the nonprofit board of directors is there. It's, you know, if you have an organization that this is their job and the board of directors is the boss of the organization, then you don't have some of those same challenges that I mentioned prior. You have flexible and nimble operations because you're likely in a startup mode and relatively small in terms of operational administrative duties, etc. You have a very focused approach because this is your mandate. And you have fundraising options. So as a nonprofit or a charity, especially as a charity, you have the tax benefits as well of that can help your fundraising options. The risks to the model are the high risk of losing the built-in and admin supports of the other models. So you have to set up your own shop, so to speak. And so there's sometimes, and we estimated this to be about 500 to 700K to set up your staff and infrastructure to run a separate organization. It's not going to come cheap. And so that can then feed into the next risk, which is the optics of using limited dollars for setting up a new organization, admin costs, AKA, not going into frontline supports. And so that can create some optics challenges for an organization as well. And those are really fair questions and criticisms of this model. And then the last one is that you now created another competitor in the sector for limited funds, right? So while you might think it's really exciting to have a new organization, in a context of less and less donor dollars going around, you might be seen as a challenger for those limited resources. In the municipality case, as being the CE, the strengths, of course, are the administrative capacity, and I would say the exact mirror of that strength is on the risk side is that it could be really overly bureaucratic, and you might respond to challenges less nimbly than a standalone organization because of the administrative processes that are in place. So it's a pro and a con. The other strength is that you're not a service provider, so you're likely or more likely to be seen as neutral, right? And we see this a lot where the municipalities often tapped to take on this role because the community de facto votes the municipality in. And again, whether it's homelessness or poverty reduction or community safety, it's this natural space where some of this work tends to be housed in the community. You also have greater access to interdepartmental policy conversations connected to homelessness. And so anything that's happening around social assistance delivery, especially in Ontario where there's responsibility for some of the other components of the social safety net, the zoning and planning work, social housing, etc. You've got this built-in access. I'm not going to say it's always easy and streamlined, but at least there's that opportunity built in for you to have these cross-departmental systems planning conversations with colleagues around issues that impact homelessness. On the risk side, I mentioned the overly bureaucratic processes that might inhibit your nimbleness and flexibility. Not always, but in some cases, we certainly see this challenge. The other challenge, as we know, is that you're subject to political changes and priorities as well. And so sometimes your nimbleness is used responding to issues rather than enacting the systems planning priorities that you may have worked really hard to develop with a shift in government or a shift in crisis management from the priorities that are set by politicians rather than systems planning staff. So that's something that you're always managing. And of course, you're inhibited at times by the ability to champion publicly. So because you're working within a municipal government, you know, how much power or leverage can staff have in terms of championing if they are accountable to senior management and ultimately to council. So how much leeway is there? Now, there's certainly lots of examples where that isn't inhibiting, but in other cases, it's quite the opposite and can definitely get in the way of that advocacy work. And so we also hear often about difficulties around innovation and risk-taking because of, again, the legal and the risk management approach in municipalities as well. Now, regardless of which option, there's a couple of things from a governance perspective that are important to keep in mind. And again, we often say easier said than done. And while these things might be obvious and kind of second nature to some of you, we see these challenges enough that we want to point them out and emphasize them, at least as a check mark and reminder for those of you that feel you're nailing governance in your community. So the first one, and again, clarifying the difference between a board of directors versus an advisory committee, right? So having that clarity and understanding where the buck stops. The development of clear policies and procedures, including conflict of interest, and if you don't have it, do so immediately and have those transparent in your community. A clear point of accountability on reconciliation for implementation as well, and we mentioned this several times as well, but having clarity within your governance model around that point of accountability for reconciliation and building that into your governance model is a great opportunity if you're thinking about revisiting your approach to governance. The membership and renewal of your community advisory board. If you're not looking at the CAB membership from that holistic perspective that we talked about earlier, thinking through whether it's time to shake things up with new membership or having limited terms so you're not getting the same people over and over again, right? So thinking about the membership from that perspective and clearly articulating future role vis-a-vis other committees and work in homelessness. So you might have a system planner organization that's the community entity and a community advisory board, but you might have a whole lot of other committees operating at the same time around homelessness related issues. And we certainly see that in spades where there's more committees than there are people to go around. And so we tend to go from committee to committee and we see the same folks around the table. I highly encourage you to think through what exactly the function of these various committees are in that overall governance of the community around homelessness. So connecting the dots and ensuring that everything has a purpose because we're all working with limited time and resources to do this work. And then, of course, the clear communications on decision making to ensure transparency in funding decisions. You likely should have an appeal process if you don't have one already, and that applies to funding, but I would say it applies to any decision making as well that might be happening in your community and in your systems planning work. So some of the common barriers that we see, and I've already referenced these already, but good to bear in mind when you think about governance in your homeless serving system. The board, whether that's the board of directors or your community advisory board, being dominated by a specific interest group. So too much of any one stakeholder group is going to influence the diversity of voices at the table. Concerns about liability, so being so hampered by risk intolerance that you're not being able to be innovative and learn from mistakes. And so creating a culture of innovation means having some comfort level with risk. Now, it's not to say that we just do everything without regard for risk. It's just that we're able to think innovatively and creatively and do appropriate risk management. Resistance to change is, of course, something that we often see, especially if you're trying to shake things up and do something creative and innovative at the local level, and you keep getting stuck in this idea that we've always been doing it this way. Too many people wanting to get involved in decisions and micromanaging. If you've ever been in a leadership role and had a board to deal with, you likely know what I'm referring to here. Weak committees, so you have committees that are in place and you give them key functions and decision-making roles, but they don't even show up to meetings, etc. So they're weak from a performance perspective, and they might not have the commitment and time, and fairly so, to do the work necessary. The tokenization of people with lived experience, or not properly supporting people with lived experience to participate fully on these boards of directors or community advisory boards. Transparency or lack thereof, we often see as a challenge. And again, policies, procedures, sticking to those, reviewing those on an annual basis. Too much or too little influence of the system planner organization or community entity in these roles. So where the staff are really setting the agenda and are bulldozing through the meetings and don't really care what the advisory is telling them, are always red flags. Insufficient in administrative capacity and funding, so not enough backbone supports and coordination to actually run the meeting smoothly. The reluctance around hard decisions, too many meetings, not enough leadership, and then the lack of system-wide outcomes. So ultimately, if your governance model is not getting you or not supporting getting you the outcomes that you need, that's one of the things you want to do some investigation of. Are things falling apart in governance? Are they falling apart in program performance, etc.? So constantly looking at governance as part of your broader systems planning work. Good governance, however, would have quite the opposite. So it would have a formally designated and active leadership structure. It would have roles and responsibilities that are clearly defined and safeguards in place around potential conflicts of interest in particular. Diverse and active membership that meets regularly with full participation from all stakeholders. It would also have decisions being made by a predetermined process that's formal, fair, and transparent, and easily communicated. Right? So it's not a hidden process. That communication process is happening at the right time, and that includes being prompt with additional explanations provided when called upon, with formal, fair, and written policies that guide decision making as well. So hopefully you can check mark all of those. And for those of you thinking through this, a couple guiding questions for you, and beginning with, again, summarizing from the beginning what we went through today. And the first one to think through is which organization or organizations is allocating your homelessness partnering strategy or reaching home funding in your community. So ideally, well, not ideally, de facto, this is your community entity. The second question is, does the community entity have a nonprofit board of directors? And so in a municipal context, it's City Council. But if you are in a nonprofit or charity model, the board of directors is ultimately responsible to answer to the funder, not the CAB. So just that point and reminder. Is this board of directors of the community entity the same group of stakeholders as the community advisory board? And if so, the CAB is more than an advisory group in that context, because they're not just shaping decisions. The CAB would also be responsible to the funders in that context. So note here, when you're making the conscious decision that the board of directors of your nonprofit is the CAB, you're giving them that function, then the board of directors is still responsible from a fiscal perspective to the funder. Is the community entity delivering funding from other sources, including provincial government? And if the decisions are divided, it's important to determine who will take on the system planning organizational role for the community in setting these directions and community-wide outcomes as well. In terms of evaluating your community governance structure, a couple of things to think about. Is there broad community trust in the agency delivering this funding? And if not, what's behind it? Is it transparency around funding decisions? This is very common. Is it the understanding of funding decisions? Is it a communications challenge? Is it representation from people with lived experience in some governance capacity, including decision making? Is it broad representation from a variety of stakeholders, including the private sector, government, and service providers that are not directly in the homeless serving system? Is the governance structure guided by the local data showing homelessness trends and making decisions on funding related to said data? So again, connecting the dots around governance to systems performance management is going to be really critical as well. Governance models are not just to do governance, it's ultimately to achieve these broader objectives as well. And then, is there an ability to create conditions for innovation and flexibility where needed for the system planning organization? So are there areas where we can reduce some of the administrative overload that is inhibiting some of the innovation to occur? Or where are there opportunities that we can do more creative problem solving to move the needle on homelessness in the community that we might want to consider? So more factors to consider as we close this module, considering reconciliation within and throughout your governance approach, systems planning expertise and building that systems planning expertise into governance, the level of trust in the community. Obviously, there's the whole idea that we can only move at the speed of trust when we do systems change work, and that's absolutely true in this case. Administrative capacity and skill in bringing in those unusual suspects in the process, and then this ability to act as a community champion and visionary around ending homelessness as well. So it's some of the factors to consider in thinking through your governance model. So with that, we wanted to thank you, and if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it as always, and I look forward to seeing you in our future modules.